I moved to Willowbrook Estates thinking I'd found paradise. The houses were pristine, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the homeowners association promised to maintain property values through what they called, quote, reasonable community standards, end quote. What I didn't realize was that our H.O.A. president, Karen Whitmore, had turned those standards into her personal fiefdom. Karen was the kind of woman who measured grass height with a ruler and kept a file cabinet full of violation notices organized by street address and date. She drove through the neighborhood each morning in her white SUV like a general inspecting troops, looking for any excuse to flex her authority. Her power came from a thick binder of bylaws she'd helped craft over 15 years of H.O.A. service, rules so detailed they specified everything from acceptable mailbox fonts to the exact shade of beige allowed on house trim. For the first few months, Karen and I coexisted peacefully. I kept my yard immaculate, parked in my garage, and made sure my trash cans were stored out of sight by 7 a.m. every collection day. I thought I was the perfect neighbor until the first violation notice appeared on my door like a scarlet letter. Quote, noise ordinance violation. Excessive sound levels detected after 9 p.m. on November 15th. Please review Section 12.4 of the Community Guidelines. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, H.O.A. President, end quote. I stared at the letter in confusion. November 15th? I'd been reading a book by 9:30, lights out by 10. The only sound I could remember making was perhaps running the dishwasher after dinner. I called Karen immediately, thinking this was clearly a mistake. Karen speaking. Oh, hello. Yes, I was walking my dog Precious around 9:15 when I heard distinctly excessive noise coming from your residence. The H.O.A. bylaws are very clear about maintaining neighborly quiet hours after 9 p.m. Me responding. I appreciate you calling, but I think there might be some confusion. I was just reading quietly. Maybe you heard my dishwasher? It's pretty quiet, and I thought kitchen appliances would be normal household sounds. Karen speaking with that tone, the bylaws don't distinguish between types of noise. Excessive is excessive. I suggest you review the community standards more carefully. We pride ourselves on maintaining peace and tranquility in Willowbrook Estates. Her voice carried that particular brand of smugness that comes with petty authority. I thanked her for the call and figured it was a one-time misunderstanding. How wrong I was. The second violation notice arrived exactly 1 week later. This time Karen claimed she'd heard, quote, disruptive sounds, end quote, at 9:05 p.m. on November 22nd. I had been washing dishes by hand that evening, trying to be extra considerate after our conversation. The soft clinking of plates and gentle running water could hardly qualify as excessive noise by any reasonable standard. I decided to visit Karen in person, hoping a face-to-face conversation might resolve whatever she thought she was hearing. Her house sat at the corner of Maple and Oak, a beige monument to H.O.A. compliance with not a single blade of grass out of place. She answered the door wearing her official H.O.A. president polo shirt, as if she were perpetually on duty. Me speaking, Karen, I wanted to talk about these noise violations. I've been incredibly careful about keeping quiet after 9, but you seem to be hearing things that I don't think qualify as excessive noise. Karen responding, arms crossed. I have very sensitive hearing, and I take my responsibilities as H.O.A. president seriously. If you're making noise after 9 p.m., you're violating community standards. It's really quite simple. Me trying to reason, but washing dishes and running a dishwasher are normal activities. Surely the bylaws were meant to address things like loud music or power tools, not basic household tasks. Karen getting more animated. The bylaws say excessive noise, period. They don't provide a list of acceptable activities, because the expectation is that residents will use common sense and courtesy. Clearly, you need more specific guidance. She disappeared into her house and returned with her infamous binder, flipping to a page marked with multiple sticky tabs. Karen reading, Section 12.4 states that any sound audible beyond the originating property lines after 9 p.m. constitutes a violation of community quiet hours. No exceptions are listed. I realized then that Karen wasn't interested in reason or compromise. She had found her weapon, and she intended to use it. What I couldn't understand was why she had chosen me as her target. My house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. My nearest neighbor was 200 feet away, and I lived alone with no parties, no loud music, and no unusual activities. The third violation notice arrived like clockwork the following week. Karen claimed she detected excessive noise at 8:57 p.m. on November 29th. I had been reading in complete silence that evening, so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. That's when I realized Karen wasn't actually hearing anything at all. She was simply targeting me with false complaints, knowing that disputing H.O.A violations was a lengthy and expensive process. I started keeping detailed logs of my activities each evening, noting exactly what I was doing at every moment after 8 p.m. I was brushing my teeth at 8:57 on November 29th. No running water, no electric toothbrush, just gentle manual brushing in my upstairs bathroom, which faced away from her house. The fourth violation notice pushed me over the edge. Karen claimed she'd heard excessive noise at 9:03 p.m. on December 6th, the exact evening I had been at my cousin's wedding reception until past midnight. I had photographic evidence, witnesses, and restaurant receipts proving I wasn't even in the neighborhood. Yet here was another violation notice waiting on my door. When I called to point out this obvious error, Karen's response was both predictable and infuriating. Karen speaking, "I walk Precious every evening at the same time and I know what I hear. Perhaps you left a television or radio running, or maybe you have house guests you haven't disclosed to the H.O.A. Tenants and visitors must also comply with community standards. I had neither television nor radio playing, no house guests, and I was beginning to understand that Karen lived in a fantasy world where her word was law and evidence was irrelevant. She had decided I was guilty, and my guilt was the only truth that mattered in her universe. That's when I started researching Karen Whitmore more thoroughly. My background in corporate law and business consulting had taught me that knowledge is power, and I suspected Karen's power came from other residents' ignorance of their rights and options. What I discovered was fascinating. Karen had been H.O.A president for 6 consecutive terms, running unopposed each time because she made life miserable for anyone who challenged her authority. She had a documented history of targeting specific residents with escalating violation campaigns, until they either moved away or submitted to her control. 3 families had sold their homes in the past 2 years specifically to escape Karen's harassment. More interesting was her financial situation. Public records showed that Karen and her husband were heavily mortgaged and behind on property taxes. Their pristine home was mortgaged at 95% of its current value, and they had 2 liens from unpaid contractor bills. Karen's desperation to maintain property values wasn't just about control, it was about financial survival. The 5th violation notice arrived on December 13th, claiming excessive noise at 9:12 p.m. on December 12th. I had been having dinner at my parents' house that evening, and didn't return home until after 11 p.m. I had credit card receipts from the restaurant, text messages confirming dinner plans, and my parents as witnesses. Karen's complaint was not just false, it was provably fraudulent. I decided it was time to visit Karen with documentation. I arrived at her door with a folder containing receipts, photos, and a timeline proving my absence during the alleged violation. She answered wearing her H.O.A polo shirt again, Precious yapping behind her legs like a tiny, angry alarm system. Me speaking calmly, "Karen, we need to discuss these violation notices. This latest one claims I was making noise on December 12th at 9:12 p.m., but I can prove I wasn't home. I have receipts, photos, and witnesses." Karen barely glancing at my folder. "I don't need to see your receipts. I know what I heard, and I trust my own senses over paperwork that could be fabricated." Me staying calm. "These are credit card receipts with timestamps and location data. I can prove I wasn't in the neighborhood when you claim I was violating noise ordinances." Karen getting defensive. "Maybe you have roommates or tenants you haven't disclosed. The H.O.A requires notification of any occupancy changes. Undisclosed residents are themselves a violation of community standards." Her ability to create new violations from thin air was almost impressive. Karen existed in a closed loop of authority where her accusations were evidence, her evidence was fact, and facts were whatever supported her predetermined conclusions. She wasn't interested in truth, justice, or community harmony. She was interested in control, and I represented something that needed to be controlled. The 6th violation notice arrived exactly 1 week later, December 20th, claiming excessive noise at 8:45 p.m. on December 19th. This time Karen had made a tactical error. December 19th was the evening of the neighborhood's annual holiday potluck, hosted by the Johnsons 3 houses down from mine. I had been at that potluck from 7 p.m. until nearly midnight, surrounded by witnesses including 2 other H.O.A. board members. I decided to attend the next H.O.A. meeting armed with evidence and witnesses. The meeting was held in Karen's living room as always, with Karen presiding over 4 other board members who seemed to exist primarily as nodding accessories to her authority. I presented my case methodically, walking through each violation notice and providing corresponding evidence of my innocence. The other board members looked uncomfortable as I laid out the pattern of false accusations, particularly when I showed them proof that I wasn't even in the neighborhood during 2 of the alleged violations. Karen sat stone-faced throughout my presentation, occasionally shuffling through her binder as if looking for new regulations to cite. Karen addressing the board. While these documents are interesting, they don't change the fact that I personally witnessed noise violations coming from this property. As H.O.A. president, my responsibility is to document violations as I observe them. I can't be expected to investigate every resident's alibi before filing appropriate notices. Board member Tom speaking hesitantly, but Karen, if he can prove he wasn't home during some of these violations, maybe we should reconsider. Karen, cutting him off, the bylaws are clear about excessive noise, and they're equally clear about the authority of H.O.A. officers to document violations. We can't start second-guessing every documented incident or we'll have chaos. I realized then that the other board members were too intimidated by Karen to challenge her directly. She had cultivated their dependence on her knowledge of the complex bylaws, positioning herself as the indispensable expert who protected them from legal liability. They might have doubts about her methods, but they lacked the confidence to override her authority. That meeting was my turning point. Karen had made it clear that evidence, reason, and truth were irrelevant to her campaign against me. She would continue filing false violation notices until I either moved away or bent to her will. What she didn't realize was that she had just declared war on someone with the resources, connections, and patience to fight back strategically. I spent the following week researching every aspect of H.O.A. law, community regulations, and property rights. My legal background gave me access to databases and consultation services that most residents couldn't afford, and I discovered several fascinating aspects of our community's legal structure. First, Willowbrook Estates was built on land that included several historical restrictions dating back to the original 1920s development. These restrictions were still legally binding and took precedence over H.O.A. bylaws. Second, our H.O.A.'s authority was derived from a master deed that contained specific procedural requirements for violation documentation and resident notification. Most interestingly, I discovered that our neighborhood's quiet hours ordinance was actually less restrictive than Karen claimed. The official city noise ordinance allowed normal household activities until 10 p.m. on weekdays and 11 p.m. on weekends. Karen had been enforcing her personal interpretation of 9 p.m. quiet hours without any legal authority. But the real treasure I found was buried deep in the historical property records. The land our neighborhood was built on had been divided from a larger estate in 1923, with specific easement rights reserved for access to a small lake that bordered the eastern edge of our development. Those easement rights had never been exercised, but they were still legally valid and attached to a specific property that hadn't been part of the original development. That property was a small parcel of land that had been overlooked when the neighborhood was planned, a narrow strip between our community and the lake that belonged to the original estate. According to the public records, that property had been owned by the same family for over a century, but the current owner was an elderly woman who lived in a nursing home in Florida. I made some phone calls and discovered that Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, age 89, owned the land but hadn't visited it in over 20 years. She had no idea it had any value or significance, and she was interested in selling to someone who would take care of the property taxes and maintenance issues that were becoming burdensome. The price she wanted was remarkably reasonable, especially considering what that small parcel of land represented. It was the key to the easement rights that provided legal access to the lake, and it occupied the exact position that would allow someone to control traffic flow through the eastern section of our neighborhood. More importantly, that land was technically outside the H.O.A.'s jurisdiction. It predated our community development by decades, and the original easement agreement specifically exempted it from any future property restrictions or association governance. Whoever owned that land could use it however they wanted, within city limits of course, without any interference from Karen's beloved H.O.A. bylaws. I purchased Mrs. Patterson's property on January 15th, exactly 2 months after Karen's first violation notice. The transaction was handled through a discreet real estate attorney who specialized in historical property rights, and the deed was recorded without fanfare in the county records office. My new property was a narrow strip of land approximately 50 feet wide and 300 feet long, running parallel to the lakeshore and connected to the road by an easement right-of-way that passed directly behind Karen's house. The easement was 20 feet wide and legally guaranteed access at all hours for any lawful purpose. Karen had no idea what I had done, of course. She continued her weekly violation notices like clockwork, each one claiming she had detected excessive noise at precisely the time I knew she was walking Precious through the neighborhood. January 22nd, January 29th, February 5th, each violation as false and petty as the last. I spent several weeks researching the most effective way to utilize my new property rights. The city zoning allowed for recreational use, small-scale agriculture, and what the code called, quote, educational or cultural activities consistent with rural character, end quote. The historical nature of the land provided additional protections for traditional uses that might not be permitted on newer developments. What I decided to do was both completely legal and absolutely devastating to Karen's sense of control. I was going to establish a nature education center and evening meditation garden that would operate primarily during the exact hours when Karen claimed to value neighborhood tranquility. The meditation garden would feature wind chimes, flowing water features, and scheduled evening programs that began at 9 p.m. and continued until 10:30 p.m. every night. These activities were specifically designed to provide exactly the kind of gentle, continuous sound that would make Karen's fabricated noise complaints about my household activities seem ridiculous by comparison. But the real genius of my plan wasn't the meditation garden itself. It was the access route. The legal easement that provided access to my property ran directly behind Karen's house, exactly where she walked Precious every evening. My evening meditation participants would be walking that same path, in groups, carrying lanterns and speaking in hushed, reverent tones about mindfulness and inner peace. I hired a landscape architect who specialized in sustainable design and historical restoration. Together, we developed plans for a meditation garden that would be both beautiful and strategically positioned to maximize its audible presence during evening hours. Wind chimes would be placed to catch the prevailing breeze, water features would provide gentle but consistent background sound, and the meditation areas would be positioned where soft-spoken group activities would carry naturally toward the surrounding neighborhood. The construction began in early March, with all permits properly filed and all zoning requirements carefully satisfied. I had learned from Karen's playbook the importance of being absolutely compliant with every regulation, leaving no room for legitimate complaints or legal challenges. Karen's first indication that something was changing came when she saw the construction vehicles using the easement behind her house. I watched from my window as she marched out to confront the work crew, her H.O.A. president polo shirt like armor, and her binder of bylaws clutched in her hands like a weapon. Karen demanding of the construction foreman, "Excuse me, you can't use this area for construction access. This is a residential neighborhood with strict H.O.A. guidelines about commercial activities and construction hours." Construction foreman politely, "Ma'am, we have all the proper permits and easement documentation. This is legal access to the property we're developing. Would you like to see our permits?" I could see Karen's confusion as she realized the workers had legitimate legal authority to be exactly where she thought her H.O.A. rules prohibited them. She spent the next hour on her phone, presumably trying to find someone in city planning who would validate her assumption that she could control activities on the easement. Her second indication that the balance of power was shifting came when she received a certified letter from my attorney. The letter politely informed her that continued false violation notices could constitute harassment under state law, and that I was prepared to document a pattern of fraudulent complaints if the behavior continued. The letter also mentioned, almost casually, that I had recently acquired property rights in the neighborhood and looked forward to being a good neighbor to everyone in the community. Karen had no way of knowing what those property rights were, or how they might affect her carefully controlled environment. The third indication was the sign. Once construction was complete, I installed a beautiful, historically appropriate wooden sign at the entrance to my property. Quote, "Willowbrook Meditation Gardens." Evening programs Monday through Sunday, 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. All welcome. Quiet reflection, mindful community, inner peace. End quote. The sign was positioned exactly where Karen would see it every evening during her walk with Precious, and it made clear that my property would be hosting regular activities during the exact hours she claimed to value absolute silence from her neighbors. Karen's first visit to my door since the H.O.A. meeting was predictably indignant. She arrived with her binder, her polo shirt, and a righteous anger that radiated from her like heat from a furnace. Karen barely controlling her voice. What is the meaning of this meditation garden nonsense? You cannot operate a business in a residential neighborhood. The H.O.A. bylaws specifically prohibit commercial activities, and I will not tolerate this violation of community standards. Me calmly. The meditation garden isn't a business, Karen. It's a personal property use that happens to welcome community participation. And it's not located within H.O.A. jurisdiction, so your bylaws don't apply to those activities. Karen getting louder. Every property in Willowbrook Estates is subject to H.O.A. authority. You cannot simply ignore community standards because you disagree with them. Me smiling slightly. Actually, my new property predates the H.O.A. by several decades. It's historically exempt from community association governance, though of course it still must comply with city and county regulations, which it does. I could see the wheels turning in Karen's mind as she tried to process this information. Her entire identity was built around being the ultimate authority in our neighborhood, the person who knew every rule and controlled every activity. The possibility that someone could operate outside her jurisdiction was literally incomprehensible to her. Karen sputtering, that's impossible. I know every property in this neighborhood, and I know every regulation that applies here. You cannot have property that isn't subject to H.O.A. authority. Me helpfully. I'd be happy to show you the historical deed and easement documentation if you'd like to review them. My attorney researched everything very thoroughly to ensure complete compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Karen stormed away without another word, but I could see her mind working. She would spend the next several days researching, calling city offices, and trying to find some regulation or authority that would allow her to shut down my meditation garden. What she discovered was both frustrating and terrifying to someone who lived for control. Not only was my property legally exempt from H.O.A. governance, but my historical easement rights meant that community members would be regularly walking behind her house during evening hours, talking quietly about mindfulness and carrying soft lanterns that cast moving shadows through her backyard. The meditation garden's opening night was scheduled for March 21st, the spring equinox. I had advertised the event through community bulletin boards, social media, and word of mouth, describing it as an opportunity for neighbors to find peace and tranquility through group meditation and mindful reflection. 23 people showed up for that first evening program, including several residents from our neighborhood, who were curious about meditation and grateful for a peaceful evening activity. We gathered at 9 p.m. sharp, just as Karen was beginning her evening walk with Precious. The program began with gentle wind chimes marking the hour, followed by a brief introduction to mindfulness practices and the history of meditation gardens. Participants then walked slowly along the designated paths, stopping at stations designed for quiet reflection and breathing exercises. The sound level was exactly what I had planned: soft conversation and gentle movement that was clearly audible, but undeniably peaceful. Wind chimes provided a musical backdrop, water features added natural white noise, and the group's quiet discussions about inner peace and community harmony created an atmosphere that was both present and non-intrusive. Karen appeared at the edge of my property within 15 minutes, Precious straining against her leash, as she tried to investigate the strangers walking through what she considered her territory. Karen stood frozen, watching 23 people engaged in exactly the kind of evening activity that made her fabricated noise complaints about my household dishwashing sound ridiculous. One meditation participant speaking softly to another. "This is so peaceful. I can't believe we live so close to such a beautiful space and never knew it was here." Another participant, "The water feature is perfect. Just enough sound to help quiet the mind without being distracting." Karen listened to these conversations with growing horror. Here were her own neighbors, people she had trained to fear H.O.A. violations and respect quiet hours, openly enjoying an evening activity that began precisely at 9 p.m. and would continue until 10:30 every single night. The truly beautiful part of my revenge was that Karen couldn't complain about the meditation garden without admitting that she had been filing false violation notices about my household activities. If gentle wind chimes, flowing water, and hushed conversations about mindfulness were acceptable evening sounds, then washing dishes and running a dishwasher were clearly not violations of any reasonable noise standard. Karen's dilemma became more acute with each passing evening. The meditation garden quickly became popular with neighborhood residents who appreciated having a peaceful evening activity within walking distance of their homes. By the end of the first week, we were regularly hosting 30 to 40 participants each night. More problematically for Karen, several of these participants were H.O.A. members who began questioning the logic of 9 p.m. quiet hours when such a lovely evening program operated until 10:30 without creating any disturbance or complaints from other residents. Tom, the board member who had seemed sympathetic during my violation hearing, speaking to another participant, this really makes me reconsider some of our H.O.A. noise policies. If this level of activity is perfectly reasonable at 9:30, maybe we've been too restrictive about normal household sounds. Karen's nightmare was becoming reality. Her authority was being undermined not by direct challenge, but by simple demonstration that her interpretation of appropriate evening noise levels was unreasonably restrictive. The meditation garden's popularity also meant that Karen's evening walks with Precious were no longer solitary tours of her domain. Every night, she encountered groups of neighbors walking peacefully along the easement behind her house, discussing mindfulness practices and community connection in voices that were quiet but clearly audible. By April 1st, exactly 4 months after Karen's first false violation notice, I was ready to implement the final phase of my revenge. The meditation garden had established that evening activities and gentle sounds were not only acceptable but welcome in our community. Now it was time to address Karen's harassment directly. I scheduled a special evening program for April 3rd, advertised as, quote, community dialogue, building understanding through mindful communication, end quote. The program was designed to address neighborhood conflicts through mediation and restorative conversation. Karen had no choice but to attend if she wanted to monitor what was happening in her neighborhood. Her absence would signal that she wasn't interested in community harmony, but her presence would force her to participate in exactly the kind of public accountability she had been avoiding. 47 residents gathered that evening, including all 5 H.O.A. board members and most of the neighbors who had been following the ongoing tension between Karen and myself. I began the program with a discussion about communication, conflict resolution, and the importance of truth in community relationships. Me addressing the group tonight, I want to talk about something that affects all of us: how we handle disagreements and misunderstandings in our community. Sometimes conflicts arise from genuine differences of opinion, and sometimes they arise from miscommunication or factual errors. I then walked the group through a hypothetical scenario involving false accusations, fraudulent complaints, and abuse of authority within community organizations. I didn't mention Karen by name, but every detail of my hypothetical matched her harassment campaign against me. Me continuing, imagine a situation where someone repeatedly files false complaints about a neighbor's behavior, claiming to witness violations that never actually occurred. How should a community respond when authority is misused for personal harassment rather than legitimate enforcement? The audience grew visibly uncomfortable as they realized I was describing real events that had affected their community. Several people glanced toward Karen, who sat rigid in her chair with Precious trembling on her lap. Me reaching the climax. And imagine that this person filed violation notices claiming the neighbor was making noise on evenings when that neighbor could prove they weren't even home. What would you call behavior like that? Tom, the board member, speaking hesitantly. That would be fraud. Another resident. That would be harassment. A third voice, that would be abuse of power. Karen's face had gone pale, and she was clutching her binder so tightly her knuckles were white. She realized that I had just publicly exposed her harassment campaign to the entire community, using the meditation garden's format of peaceful dialogue to create a forum she couldn't control or escape. Me looking directly at Karen, the beautiful thing about truth is that it always comes to light eventually. And the beautiful thing about community is that we can choose to support behaviors that bring us together, rather than tactics that tear us apart. The meditation session concluded with participants sharing their thoughts about accountability, forgiveness, and creating positive community relationships. Multiple residents spoke about the importance of honesty in neighborhood leadership and the damage caused by false accusations. Karen left without speaking to anyone, but I could see in her eyes that she understood exactly what had happened. Her secret campaign of harassment had been exposed, her authority had been undermined, and her community now saw her as someone who abused power rather than someone who protected their interests. But I wasn't finished yet. The next morning, Karen found a certified letter waiting in her mailbox. Inside was a comprehensive documentation of every false violation notice she had sent me, complete with corresponding evidence proving my innocence in each case. Credit card receipts, restaurant timestamps, witness statements, photographs, and even security camera footage from the neighborhood potluck. The letter concluded with a simple statement. Quote, "Continued harassment through fraudulent H.O.A. violation notices will result in legal action for abuse of process, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of state anti-harassment statutes. Additionally, this documentation has been shared with all H.O.A. board members for their review and consideration." End quote. Karen's reign of petty tyranny was over, but the final blow was still coming. That afternoon, she received a second piece of certified mail. This one was from the H.O.A. board, informing her that an emergency meeting had been called to address concerns about her conduct as president. The meeting would be held in the community center rather than her living room, and it would be open to all residents. The emergency meeting was scheduled for April 10th, 1 week after my community dialogue program. During that week, Karen made several desperate attempts to reassert her authority and discredit my documentation, but her efforts only made her situation worse. She tried calling city offices to complain about the meditation garden, but was told that all permits were in order and no noise complaints had been filed by other residents. She attempted to rally support from other board members, but found them increasingly uncomfortable with defending false violation notices. She even considered resigning before the emergency meeting, but realized that leaving would be an admission of guilt that would follow her to any future H.O.A. position. The night of the emergency meeting, over 60 residents packed the community center. Karen sat at a folding table facing an audience that included people she had harassed, people she had intimidated, and people who were finally ready to hold her accountable for years of abuse. I presented my documentation calmly and thoroughly, walking through each false violation notice and corresponding evidence. I didn't need to be dramatic or emotional. The facts spoke for themselves. Karen had filed 6 violation notices claiming I was making excessive noise at specific times on specific dates when I could prove I wasn't even home. Me concluding my presentation, the pattern is clear and undeniable. These weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. These were deliberate false accusations designed to harass me into compliance or force me to move away from the neighborhood. The board members looked stricken as they reviewed my evidence. Tom, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Karen's authoritarian approach, was the first to speak. Tom, addressing Karen directly, "Karen, how do you explain violation notices filed for times when he can prove he wasn't home?" Karen desperately, "I reported what I observed at the time. Perhaps I was mistaken about some dates, but my intention was always to maintain community standards." Another board member, "But these aren't simple date errors. These are completely fabricated incidents. You claim to hear noise from someone who wasn't even in the neighborhood." The room was silent as residents absorbed the full scope of Karen's deception. This wasn't just about noise violations. It was about the fundamental trustworthiness of their H.O.A. leadership. A resident from the back of the room, "How many other people have you done this to?" Another voice, "How many families moved away because of false accusations?" Karen looked around the room and realized that she was completely alone. Her authority was gone, her credibility was destroyed, and her community had turned against her. But the final shock was still coming. Tom, reading from prepared notes, "Based on this evidence and similar complaints from other residents, the H.O.A. board is calling for your immediate resignation as president. Additionally, we will be reviewing all violation notices you have filed over the past 3 years to identify other potential cases of fraudulent complaints." Karen's mouth fell open as she realized the full scope of what I had unleashed. Not only was her presidency over, but every violation notice she had ever filed would now be scrutinized for accuracy and legitimacy. Years of petty harassment and abuse of authority were about to be exposed and potentially reversed. Karen, standing shakily, "This is ridiculous. I have served this community faithfully for 15 years. I will not be forced out by someone who bought his way into undermining our established order." Me, smiling calmly. "Actually, Karen, I think you'll find that truth and accountability are the established order in healthy communities. What you've been running here is something quite different." The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations as residents realized they were witnessing the end of Karen's reign. But I had saved the most devastating revelation for last. Me, addressing the room. "I want everyone to know that the meditation garden will continue operating every evening from 9 to 10:30 p.m., as it has for the past month. The activities you've all witnessed there represent exactly the kind of evening noise that Karen claimed was unacceptable when it came from normal household activities like washing dishes or running appliances." Me, looking directly at Karen. "The garden demonstrates that reasonable people can distinguish between genuinely disruptive noise and normal life sounds." Karen's violation notices weren't about maintaining community standards. They were about harassment, pure and simple. Karen's face went white as she finally understood the full scope of my revenge. I hadn't just defended myself against her false accusations. I had created a permanent demonstration of how unreasonable those accusations were. Every night, for as long as I owned the meditation garden, the community would be reminded that Karen had tried to prohibit normal household sounds, while actual evening activities with actual sound levels were welcomed and celebrated. Her own neighbors, the people she had controlled and intimidated for years, were now gathering nightly to enjoy activities that proved her noise complaints were not just false, but absurdly petty. The meditation garden would operate indefinitely, a permanent monument to her abuse of authority, and an ongoing celebration of the community harmony she had tried to destroy. Karen stood frozen, staring at me with a mixture of shock, rage, and dawning comprehension. She finally understood that she hadn't just lost a battle. She had lost everything, and she had lost it to someone who had used her own tactics, legal technicalities, community involvement, and careful documentation to completely outmaneuver her. The woman who had built her identity around being the neighborhood's ultimate authority was now the neighborhood's cautionary tale, and the meditation garden behind her house would remind everyone of that fact every single evening for years to come. Karen's face crumpled as the full weight of her defeat settled over her, and for the first time in 15 years, she had absolutely nothing to say.